The first officially recognized science fiction story was written by a man named Lucian of Samosata in ancient Greece and was penned around the year 200 AD. He was a satirist who mocked the often embellished stories of exploration that were published by those brave enough to cross an ocean that, at the time, still may have very well led to the precipitous edge of the planet. He opened the book by stating it was a work of fiction, to his credit, but talked of wooden ships sailing to the moon to aid in a battle between the Moon Men and the Solar Empire over who could terraform Venus. These themes, especially as they were envisioned almost 1,800 years ago, are shockingly similar to some of our own, albeit with a bit less giant ant steeds and solar civilizations. Since then, sci-fi has covered a vast range of topics, from dystopias to action-packed laser battles, and even a great deal of philosophizing. But in a world where the writer is trying to paint a grand and galaxy-spanning view, they often forget about the common man who would be born there. Warhammer 40k is almost always about the superhuman and perhaps a bit Xenos Primarchs and Astartes. Star Wars focuses heavily on the most powerful of its characters, even to the point of creating lineage where none existed. And the only purpose a red-shirted crewmate aboard a Federation starship seems to be as a meat shield before the villain can reach our core commanders. But rarely is a human ever deified, ever remembered for their exploits. For over 110 billion humans that have ever lived on Earth, there are vastly less that are remembered. So let's say life gives you a compromise. You aren't one of the heroes, but you get to live in the far future. Humanity has begun its expansion into interstellar space, and you decided to join. You were tested and deemed fit to travel aboard only one of a few hundred existing interstellar ships, the first wave of an exponential tsunami of colonization and innovation, the end stage of which could arrive billions of years later carrying intelligence that would appear as something far beyond humanity. What would your life look like? What would bring you joy or become your greatest stressor? What would the future be like for the life of an interstellar colonist? Before we begin, subscribe if you enjoy this kind of content. I may have been on YouTube for more than 5 years, but I'm still learning more about the platform. Apparently, liking a video makes it appear more in the algorithm, so if you think it deserves one, go ahead and give it a like. Yes, I hate these sections too. So, we need to begin with a relative timeline. With how technology is currently advancing or being allowed to advance through budget restraints, the first interstellar ship containing humans has yet to be discussed. But this isn't to say we haven't been sitting on the idea all the while. One of the prospects for missions immediately after the Saturn V took men to the moon was an idea for an engine capable of taking even more of humanity to Alpha Centauri, and the engine is still one of the best options we've ever thought up. You may have heard of the Orion drive before if you've watched any other futurism video. But in very short, it is a massive spring-mounted plate that ejects atomic bombs behind it, riding the blast while both shielding the crew and turning that shockwave of matter into a smooth acceleration through its mounts. And while humans have been off the table for most of these missions, we are already planning to send ships there, and one that could launch within the next decade. Tiny probes mounted to vast solar sails could catch beamed laser light, accelerating them to speeds reaching that of the light they ride. They could fly past and image the Alpha Centauri star system within a few decades, not hundreds of years, and beam their findings back to Earth within 4 years. We may have pictures of an alien planet within our lifetime, but certainly no planted boots or flags. So, with all of this in mind, as well as considering the current climate of space exploration, when could we expect to set this theoretical timeline? As with almost every single prediction humanity has made of the future, I will be almost laughably wrong. But I'll stick my neck out and say that this human will be born about 300 years from now, giving a nice stardate of 2323. At this point in time, based on how medical and technological innovations are changing the modern day, this time period will look vastly different to what we are used to. I know I say that often in futurism videos I've done in the past, but the statement remains true even if we haven't built any interstellar ships by then. One of the most commonly used illustrations of just how quickly technology has changed the world is the 66-year difference between the first powered flight and humanity landing on the moon. 300 years from now is quite a bit of time for additional improvements to be made. Medical experimentation today is more widely focused on the curing of diseases like Alzheimer's and cancer, while also exploring and learning about the brain and how to best understand what exact processes are responsible for what macroscopic behaviors. We are also heavily invested in the extension of life, hopefully permanently, and we have already exceeded explosively in this effort, taking the average human lifespan from the 30 or 40 years our ancestors were used to and giving us averages of 70 to 80. Our current best guess on how to accomplish eternal life, or at least how to begin doing so, is the replenishing and reinforcing of telomeres in our DNA. Telomeres, in a brief segue, are strands of our genetic code that attach to the ends of our chromosomes and shorten as each cell they inhabited and grew divides. But once they grow too short, those chromosomes can no longer replicate, contributing to the effects of aging. But if these telomeres are replenished indefinitely, they become cancerous, dividing forever and growing into unnatural formations, so a middle ground needs to be reached. So, in the life of this future colonist, even if eternal life hadn't been achieved, it would still be vastly extended when compared to our own, as well as them having been inoculated and protected against many diseases we today still see as being formidable foes. Physiological monitoring technology will have been improved, possibly alerting the individual to all manner of currently invisible deficiencies or errors within their body, allowing for a far greater amount of health reinforcement and more informed treatment decisions. Our colonists may be as healthy and in shape as the modern-day bodybuilder and health nut that can devote large amounts of their lives to the upkeep of their forms. They may even have built-in mental tunings that could lessen or eliminate the stresses and solitudes normally associated with people traveling millions of miles from home without a clear path back. So, our colonist has been selected for a mission to another star. Proxima Centauri, with its exoplanet orbiting within its star's habitable zone, will have been our first destination. But what other prospected stars are we interested in visiting? The answer to that, if we had infinite resources, would be all of them. But if we had to choose one to add to our expansion, Luton B may provide a worthwhile expedition. Luton, the star around which this exoplanet revolves, is about 12 light-years from Earth. The planet orbits within a habitable zone and has been praised as one of the most Earth-like planets we have ever discovered, despite being about 2.9 times the mass of Earth. We are so confident in its potential habitability for life that we have even sent radio greetings and instructions to this world in 2018, which may arrive to greet possible inhabitants by the year 2030. Whether we receive a response or not, this world looks quite promising for the supporting of life, and even if something reaches back out to say hello, we would still attempt a more in-person greeting. But for this exercise, the world is apparently entirely dead, as a first contact situation is a topic for another video. So our colonist is briefed on what to expect on this lifeless but potentially supportive super-Earth. The gravity will be punishing, and alterations to their body will need to be made, such as a more powerful heart to lift all of the blood that would pool in their legs to the rest of their body, and most importantly, the brain. Musculature will need to be reworked for any movements on the surface to be made, and skeletal structure will need reinforcing. These changes could be made during their travel or once they had reached the world, or could even be skipped altogether if robotic bodies could be transferred to or be remotely operated. As to the possibility of such modifications within a 300-year deadline, I believe digital transference to robotic bodies may still be a dream of tomorrow, as we know and invest far more into discovering how our bodies work than what consciousness is. The necessity for replacement organs and limbs to work with millions of different chemical systems without the body attempting to destroy them is a high priority, especially with the introduction of new manufacturing methods like 3D printing and lattice cell growth. I remember when 3D printing really began to take off, and even during its initially short lifespan, it has shown massive improvements in many unexpected directions. Rocket nozzles, dental implants, replacement limbs, concrete houses, organ tissues, and food. Even the accomplishment of becoming a common household product in such short a time shows that an industrial fire has been lit, and while the technology will always have limitations, we are just now beginning to see what is possible with them. In this potential future, these body modifications will be handled by a rather tedious but highly advanced surgery aided by printed materials that can be made within hours from any one of the hundreds of onboard printing devices. They would mainly be used for medical and industrial use, and would see a vast variety of purposes and sizes. While the classic view of a starship kitchen may include them for things like making food magically appear, this may not be far from the truth, but with a pinch of salt. The more variety you want, the more storage you'll need for the feedstock, and we may have to get creative with the food on the end of the printing session. These printers could also see use in recycling and making eating implements, reusing and sterilizing the plastics through remelting and washing. 3D printers could also be seen deep within the hulls of our colony ships, waiting dozens of years to activate and on truly colossal scales. Once a planet has been reached, the colonists may want somewhere else to stay other than the ship they've spent centuries aboard, especially if the goal is permanent expansion. Power generators, housing infrastructure, aerospace transportation, and hundreds of other subsystems will need to be built, and 3D printers were designed to do this from the start. Matter extruders attached to vast industrial kilns could manufacture complex framework and paneling for any number of orbital or ground-based structures, from the smallest blanket solar paneling to bridge girders needing to support thousands of tons in any alien environment. However, it may be prudent to have a printing factory both in orbit and on the surface, unless you want to worry about whatever you built surviving a trip from orbit, atmosphere or not. With all of this in mind, let's return to our colonist, who has just been handed a decision. They've decided to specialize in what they believe is the more enjoyable option for stationing, that being a surface-based electrician, as a multitude of digital and power systems will need to be connected, tested, and activated once infrastructure requires it. This will need either the surgical procedure mentioned previously to strengthen them against the harsh gravity of their new world, or a costly and near daily commute back into the exact opposite extreme of microgravity. They opt for the former, and are then asked a follow-up question. Their surgery will be non-invasive, but still devastating, and will use some of the smallest 3D printers we have yet to create. I realize that nanotechnology is still very much in its infancy, but chemistry is far from a new science, and may hint at ways to merge the two. General muscle growth can be accomplished using a mixture of growth hormones and low-energy electrical fields, perhaps even sonic frequencies. But getting the heart stronger and strengthening the walls of the cardiovascular system against rupturing, while also not limiting the natural flow of matter between the body and its blood, will be difficult to engineer on a chemical and physical level. Here we could employ basic nanotechnology, perhaps simply a selection of proteins we had tricked into acting as a matter-binding bacteria that wouldn't aggravate the immune system response with their constructions or presence. They could administer medicines to very select types of cells, and could even be contained to select areas and organs using sonic barriers. But the skeleton will be a vastly different story. The entire purpose of bone is for tendons to attach to them, basically holding up everything our bodies are made of, from the toughness of tendon to the jelly-like consistency of the brain, and all of this mass needs to remain stable in an already gravity-intensive environment. The attachment points on our bones will need special attention as not to separate or weaken their bonds during modification. Such a task may be accomplished using a rigid substance in a coating along their surfaces, thick enough to add additional support, but thin enough to still allow fluid transfer, perhaps filled with microscopic perforations, as bones not only hold up all of our extra gooey bits, but also produce all of the blood in our bodies, and blocking this ability would be catastrophic. This could be achieved through the use of artificially engineered bacteria, as microorganisms could be tricked into depositing select elements across bone surfaces, and the perforations could be induced using focused sonic frequencies that create patterns of concentration across the body, essentially sonic no-go zones for cellular growth that keep out our metallic bacteria. But no matter what method is used to accomplish these physiological changes, it will be a long and destructive process to the body, possibly even incredibly painful. And this is where our colonist's next decision comes into play. Interstellar travel is still in its infancy in our colonist's time period, which means no FTL travel or risk-free cryo chambers, which by the way is a possible topic for the next video I do, which was voted on under the community tab of the channel. Check it out if you'd like to vote on the next one. Colonists on long-duration flights haven't unlocked the secrets to reliable cryosleep, but still have created an equivalent through the use of medically induced comas. These people are cycled out through these coma beds while being watched over by other on-duty travelers, who also tend to the ship and send back regular progress reports to Earth. Colonists could rotate through these multi-year-long sleep schedules in order to slightly accelerate their perceived time of the overall trip, while also allowing for the necessary presence of commanders and engineers in case one of 100 million different parts of the ship malfunctions in the harshest known environment of radioactive, unshielded interstellar space. Sci-fi often shows massive colony ships full of totally unconscious crew members while maybe throwing in a fleet of automated repair drones. But I'd like to point something out to skew this idea a bit. How long do you expect the device you're watching this video on to keep functioning? Is it more than 100 years? I'm willing to make a slightly informed guess to say no, even on timescales of decades. Now, do you want your device to undertake the task of keeping hundreds of sleeping and highly sensitive humans alive for an additional lifetime, while also maintaining something as advanced and exposed as an interstellar ship functioning at 100%? Probably not. Even though I personally believe that artificial intelligence will grow to heights near indistinguishable from human minds, they will still be made of materials that cannot self-heal, and be regulated through advanced chemical sciences like humans can. And while they may be able to solve advanced issues they are presented with, they do not exist in a physical sense, and are only familiar with whatever aspects of reality we could convey to them in a totally different informational capacity from what the rest of the universe is based in, that being electronic data. This isn't to say that artificial intelligences won't be aboard our starships, as the monitoring or upkeeps of simple components will be uniquely suited to them, as they can most often only break in one or two ways and can be replaced with minimal physical effort. And the constant monitoring of these systems may prove to be soul-crushing for any human we chose to traverse the innards of a several-mile-long ship and all of its millions of interlocked mechanisms, marking down a checklist as thick as the Bible. The long timescales will still be an issue for everything within, fleshy or not. But here our colonists could use these timescales as a boon. Their surgery could be done on Earth in a well-regulated environment, but will take many months of healing to finalize, possibly while already in an induced coma. Resources could be saved by modifying colonists while en route, as they will need a lot of the one thing the ship has an abundance of: time. This is the procedure the colonist elects for, and once a long day of finalizing earthbound property, income, and legal relations, our traveler returns to a home that will be theirs for only one more day, and sleeps their last on the planet Earth. It does not come easily with all of the worries and excitement running through their mind. Tomorrow they will be separated from the cradle of humanity for hundreds of years, even if a return trip is planned or expected to be met. And they cannot wait to feel the warmth of a star other than their own, and dig their fingers into soil that has been exposed to truly alien environments. The next day begins with a storm of tasks finalizing their separation from home, transportation to the launch site, and multiple physical checkups. They will be boarding the final crew transport, only holding about a dozen colonists, on board a conventional low Earth orbit transport that will join the far larger ship in its orbital dry dock. Ignition begins, and as they lift off, they watch the surface grow smaller, perhaps the last they will ever see of the surface of their homeworld. Docking in orbit is achieved, and they are ushered into the bowels of their new home, the monolithic Copernicus. The innards of the ship are surprisingly plush, compared to a high-end resort, complete with a football field-sized research center stocked with cutting-edge instruments, a movie theater, a spin-gravity ring that can accommodate hundreds, zero-gravity gym and sports area, comms room with a personal-use high-powered telescope, a vast glass observation chamber, hydroponics bay with dozens of varied crops, aquaponics module for diet variety and hydroponics support, a half-mile-long coma bank, gigantic printing and manufacturing bays, and hundreds of separate personal and spacious crew quarters. The ship is powered by an array of 6 nuclear reactors, and moved using a fusion torch drive, essentially a fusion reactor that produces thrust using its plasma instead of energy, and named after just how bright and powerful its plume is even as seen from the surface of Earth. Our colonist is impressed with just how much effort has been put into every detail for the promotion of comfort and ergonomics, as spending a lifetime aboard an uncomfortable and utilitarian ship would be maddening to say the least. They are taken to a cylindrical room that gradually spins around them, and they notice 2 entry hatches turning slowly opposite one another. They are surprised when one of the staff presses a button and a whir of motorized motion rattles its way towards one of the hatches. The doorway opens into a small box hanging below them, and the colonist realizes to their surprise that the ship uses an elevator system to enter and exit the gravity rings, resting at the bottom until activated. They board the elevator, realizing that they are gradually drawn down to its floor by the already gentle rate of spin. The pull on their feet increases as they descend, until they come to a stop that is hard to track with all of the new gravitational pressure. The sensation is sudden and nauseating, and they are reassured that the next step is a lengthy adjustment period in their quarters to the new gravity. Even though the ring could be spun to whatever gravity they need, it has been decreased to produce about 80% of Earth's surface condition, to promote an easier transition between the quarters and the rest of the ship. They are warned that many things on the ship may be hard to adjust to, including the stars rotating around their heads once every 2 minutes, and that they will get used to it eventually with the aid of stabilizing medicines and time. Their quarters are spacious and comfortable, with a computer terminal, folding bed, bathroom, and shower. As an electrician, they are introduced to the rest of the engineering staff and given access to the deepest bowels of the ship. They are shown the reactor array, as well as the fueling systems and shielding of the fusion drive. The main engine is a truly gigantic affair, with everything needed to power and feed it taking up hundreds of square meters of space. Indeed, the engine bell is almost 100 meters across, a semicircle the size of a building shot through with enough energy to vaporize a city. It is essentially a gigantic Star Wars-esque death laser shackled to the task of moving 1,000,000 tons of metal. Our colonist revels in the presence of a machine of such power. Truly, humanity is becoming the masters of the universe. They float their way back to the gravity ring, quite sick from the absence of gravity and its fluid regulation, and rest for a while in their quarters. Soon they will be underway once all of the cargo has been lashed and attached. The journey is about to begin. 2 days later, the last of the press leaves through the hatch of an orbital shuttle, sealing it for the last for over 60 years, and the crew springs into action. Stations are manned, and endless checklists are run, searching every inch of every available system to discover a fault before they leave the one planet in the universe that has unique part manufacturing capability. Our colonist is stationed at the reactors, and once the signal is given by several chains of command, the reactors are pitched up. They hear the thrumming of gigantic pressure systems groaning into their new permanent state, and finally, after what seems like an hour of spooling up, the main engine fires. The sound is immense and bone-rattling, and our traveler hopes that the noise will not transfer into the habitation ray. The ship is spurned into movement, gradually and painstakingly, and they notice as motes of dust begin picking up speed as they fly past their face towards the rear of the ship. They sigh in both the relief that everything is functioning properly and in anticipation of the long trip that is now inescapable. They are now underway, with only about 60 years between them and the untamed beyond. Once the colonist's duty has been performed, they make their way back to the gravity ring, watching with fascinated amusement as several spherical drones monitor an unseen process in the walls, jetting about on gusts of compressed oxygen and spinning precisely to observe them momentarily using miniature gyroscopes. Within the ring is a small hospital and operating facility, with the purpose of completing difficult procedures within gravity. They lie on one of the tables and are given a myriad of injections, both in preparation for their alterations and a several-year-long sleep. They take one last look around them as the anesthetic kicks in, knowing that when they awake, they will be billions of miles from Earth and in a vastly different body. All goes dark and stays that way for many years. When they awake, they are uncoordinated and sickly, spending several days in a trauma bed moving in and out of consciousness. Eventually, they feel fine enough to migrate back into the gravity ring of their quarters, helped there by several medical technicians. The next few days are surprisingly miserable, and every inch of them feels weak. This is one of the unavoidable complications with both zero gravity and the effects of their long sleep. Once they have adjusted, they sign themselves back onto the duty roster and begin their short period of wakefulness, tending to an already long list of discovered issues. They begin a litany of repairs, saving one in particular for last, one that will require a spacewalk to accomplish. Creaking had been reported from the gravity ring hinge, and their bearings will need to be inspected from the outside. The colonist dons a spacesuit, one that is far smaller and more agile than the ancient EVA suits NASA had once created, and is able to be donned by only themselves instead of needing an entire team to do so. They exit the hatch and tether themselves to one of several anchor rungs. They discovered a shattered bearing ball clanging around inside the slowly rotating shaft of the gravity ring, and gingerly replace it with a new one. They request what they should do with the broken bearing and are expressly told to just chuck it as far as they can to the side of the ship. Anything flying alongside them would pose a hazard to the ship and the planet they are aiming for, but a nudge in a perpendicular direction would cause it to miss the solar system entirely. They do so with glee, watching the tiny shattered ball of aluminum vanish into the void, knowing that they have separated them by light years upon arrival. Once they have checked the exterior for damages and returned with nothing, they climb back aboard and decide to begin exploring the ship in earnest. While the interior has been laid out with comfort and relaxation in mind, they can still pick out where the inner world merges with the systems that keep it in check, and every panel they needed to remove in order to replace a component immediately opens into a sea of pipework and wiring. They hear the hiss of liquid ammonia pumping endlessly around every exposed internal surfaces, and running back out into a set of secondary heat radiators, with the main array being used primarily to dissipate the truly immense temperatures created in the main engine. The vast metallic hallways are uncannily empty, as nearly 80% of the crew is currently strapped to a coma bed deep in sleep. They meet a few of those currently on duty, and learn that a movie will be shown in a few hours, one beamed there from Earth a few years ago. And they are surprised to learn that it's about their ship. They find the film rather amusing, as do all who view it. Supposedly what awaits them, according to a rather impassioned director, is a planet full of aliens hell-bent on invading Earth, and their ship heroically genocides the entire planet of evil Xenos using their torch drive, which our electrical engineer cannot help but chuckle at, somehow using the power of one fusion reactor to quite literally explode the planet. But not after, of course, a heroic sacrifice from Captain Arthur, played by an actor they recognize but now appearing to be quite a bit older than they remembered. The film is enjoyable, if a bit silly, thankfully not showing too much of their crew dying in the effort, as those kinds of things, while not alien in nature, are still possible. The next 2 months of wakefulness are sporadically shot with minor repair requests. A light bulb here, broken wire there, and a mandatory cycling of the front-facing impact plating, all of which could be done internally, as the plates are pulled in on rolling tracks into a small hangar bay and are remounted with the exact same plate after running them through a resmelting process to repair cracking and pitting. They are shocked to discover a gigantic hole in one of these panels, appearing as though someone with a railgun had made a passing shot as they hurtled through the void. Some quick math reveals that something the size of a grain of salt had been the culprit, and they are surprised to learn that such objects are too small for the laser defense system mounted to the stern to track, but still seen as a non-threat. The ship is equipped with several high-powered lasers and manned by a particularly impressive radar array, capable of detecting something the size of a pea at 500 kilometers. But even this distance makes them nervous. This would give the lasers only a fraction of a second to swivel, acquire, and fire, but the engineers responsible for their design have taken this into account. The lasers operate in a phased array, requiring no moving parts to direct their beams and able to snap to a coordinate within nanoseconds. They can completely vaporize smaller threads, but need to fire enough energy into the larger chunks of debris to vaporize a small portion of their mass, giving them a boost powerful enough to move out of the way of their hypersonic habitat that is still picking up speed with every passing day. The main engine has been firing ceaselessly since they first went into sleep several years ago, and the engine's repair list has been admirably sparse, with the goal of reaching 20% of light speed seemingly achievable but still far in the future of their mission. On their explorations, they are introduced to the interior of the hydroponics module, amazed at the sheer mass and variety of the flora. A host of freshwater and detritivore fish dart in and out of view from large glass troughs, vanishing into the expansive root networks of their crops. They briefly marvel at how accommodated the fish have become to surviving in water without a gravitational influence, to say the least for all the greenery. An attendant notices our colonist's wide-eyed stare as she floats past and offers them a tour. She explains how every chemical process is kept in check as naturally as possible, with fish, specific species of plants, algae, and even microbial vats adding to the 60-year-long garden's health. The colonist decides that this has already become their favorite area of the ship, as it feels closest to home. After they leave, they ruminate on the tour and the woman who guided them through it. Perhaps there was more than one reason to return. Here we will skip ahead in time, far ahead. Multiple cycles of induced comas and wakefulness have passed, and many trillions of miles have been traversed. The ship's engines cut out about a decade into the trip, after reaching their top speed of 20% the speed of light. The ship has been coasting ever since, waiting to flip itself around when the moment is right to begin decelerating, but that moment is still far off. Our colonist and their botanist friend have since struck up a relationship whenever the two of them are lucid, and are planning on starting a family on the new world once they arrive. While tending to the ship's fauna reserves is a self-described idyllic job by the botanist, the list of electrical repairs has lengthened with each passing crew rotation. Nothing the colonist and their access to the manufacturing printer bay couldn't handle, but a few of the more critical systems have needed attention as of late. They are also alarmed to see that several of the colonists who were under a medical sleep a few years ago had died due to an unforeseen and untreated spread of a mold, after a droplet of inoculated water had hidden itself in a nearby ventilation duct. As a result, a veritable army of jet-powered drones had been released into every corner the crew couldn't squeeze into, armed with ultraviolet lights and alcohol sprays to cleanse the entirety of the ship inside and out. But other things have happened since their first cycle, the majority of them astounding. An impact with a passing chunk of debris had left a strangely colored char to the front plating, and when it had been removed for recycling, the attendant thought to ask one of the on-duty geologists about it, leading to humanity's first discovery of hydrocarbons within interstellar space. It seems as though the universe is filled to the brim with everything needed for life, and estimations for just how possible alien life was elsewhere were given new and more hopeful considerations. There was a lot to keep up with not only aboard the Copernicus, but in all of the millions of gigabytes of data received from Earth as the years had crept on. Entertainment and media, of course, but also new scientific discoveries, new and improved blueprints for usable tech, software updates for their systems, and even a newly developed artificial intelligence specifically designed and incorporated into the latest of interstellar ships. Our colonists' shift comes to an end, and as they report back to the coma bank, they are told that the turnaround sequence will begin while they are asleep, and that arrival should happen within a few more years. They rest both excited and uneasy. Their new home is rapidly nearing. The hard part is about to begin. Let's skip forward again right to this exact day. The engines have been firing and are now joined by the secondaries, tightening their entry and bleeding off unforecasted speeds gained during the trip. Their speed has decreased from 20% of the speed of light all the way down to only a few hundred kilometers per hour, with the target speed being a few dozen while in orbit. A new light shines through the portholes, one of a strange and alien color. Not quite the white of Sol, but tinged with a noticeable orange. Their destination planet can be seen readily from any one of these windows, a distant reddish gem of light endlessly studied by the onboard telescopes. There are no visible signs of life, both to the relief of some and the dismay of others. There won't be anyone home to disagree with their intrusion, but there also won't be any animal life to catalog and study. The excitement on board is palpable, especially down in the manufacturing bays. Already, Titanic printers have begun the creation of basic space station cores that will be developed once in orbit, and added onto once the ship's bays have enough space to accommodate their additional modules. These stations aren't what we today may think of as space stations, but more akin to void-bound skyscrapers, filled with all manner of useful spaces intended to keep their crew alive and in comfort for even longer than the trip has taken. Most of the colonists and their offspring will live in these stations, for which dozens of cores have already been constructed or planned. But a select few will actually live on the surface, they being the ones responsible for its exploration and possible terraformation. The ship almost appears as though it will crash directly into their destination world, as the engines ceaselessly fire, swiveling at odd intervals to correct their momentum under the new gravitational influence. As the ship approaches, they are able to make out a slowing of momentum, counting how fast surface features pass under their fingers, getting a larger amount of time with each measurement until suddenly the ship goes silent. They have finally arrived. A deafening cheer rings out amongst the crew, all of which are awake to view the occasion. 12 light years and 6 decades have passed, with several casualties to mark the trail. But humanity has now reached out further into the universe than ever before, and are about to touch the surface of yet another alien world. All manner of scanning equipment is powered on and thrown wide open, soaking in all the data they can grasp and relaying it to the hungry and excited eyes of a few dozen teams of dedicated onboard analysts. A crew of geologists and chemists already begin to speculate on the process of terraformation, and our colonist overhears a common worry being considered: their proximity to Luton. Their new star is a red dwarf, and therefore subject to occasional flares of hyperactivity and dormancy. Our own star does this as well, albeit to a far smaller degree, to the point that it becomes almost negligible, with enough of an early warning system for the rare solar flares that Sol produces. Every 11 years, our own star's magnetic field flips direction, causing years of increased and dormant activity respectively. This process is easily measured using sunspot observatories, as sunspots form over turbulent areas of coronal flow, and can act as signs that the sun is becoming more active. But the new world itself also offers some unique challenges for our colonists to overcome. The largest difference between Earth and Luton B is that while Earth orbits around 151 million kilometers, or exactly 1 AU from our Sun, Luton B orbits around 13.6 million kilometers, or 0.091 AU, far smaller than even the orbit of Mercury. This is possible due to the diameter of the star Luton being about 300,000 miles, compared to our own Sun's diameter of 865,000 miles. Luton is also far dimmer and less energetic overall than Sol, allowing for a habitable zone where we would expect molten worlds to exist otherwise. While planets in close proximity to their star, like in the case of Luton B, will often lock themselves into facing the same side towards their sun, called a tidal locking due to the proximity of the interacting gravitational fields, Luton B actually has a high elliptical orbit, saving it from becoming locked and entering a spin orbital resonance of 3:2 and 2:1 respectively. The planet orbits so closely to its star that its year lasts an incredible 18.6 days, but surprisingly only receives about 6% more sunlight than Earth does, and is stable enough to keep liquid water on its surface. Though the planet is not tidally locked, it still spins slowly, especially when compared to its already short year. This will mean that sunlight will pour onto the surface of the planet for many Earth days, and the nights will be just as long. The highly elliptical nature of its orbit will also mean that day length will vary widely when farthest and closest to its star. The world will need quite a bit of work to become livable for humans, but many on board are hoping that it already is livable. If not for them, then something else. If a planet is host to life for long enough, it will be unmistakable from orbit. even from light years away, as they may have also changed their atmosphere to something unnatural as we have on our world. From orbit, the Copernicus is able to detect these signs with greater accuracy and find strange elements in the atmosphere. There are no obvious signs of life, no city lights or vegetation, just vast oceans and occasional islands. But the atmosphere tells a different story. It is still mostly nitrogen, as was determined by the crew early on in their flight, but there are trace amounts of methane being constantly generated and broken down in the atmosphere, possibly hinting at a microbial presence. But more hands-on research will need to be done to find them. This methane release could also occur after volcanic activity, several of which have already been found dotting the seas. Most of them are dormant, but a few still show faint signs of action, and whether they have always been this way or are building up to an eventual massive release remains to be discovered. This discovery, while possibly the first sign of human-discovered alien life, begins to raise a few worrying questions. If there is a microbial presence in the ocean, do they have the right to colonize the world at all? After all, we humans started out the exact same way, and needed billions of years of relatively uninterrupted development in order to become the creatures of reason and exploration we are now. If there is life here, should we allow it the billions of years it needs to possibly become something greater? Is it possible that this life has existed in a single cellular fashion long enough that it is apparent it will evolve no further? If the only life we've discovered so far is microbial, do we really have the right to take its world? The answer given to these questions by the lead researcher is a solemn "we need more information." And while it may be true, that doesn't do much to dissuade the collective anxiety. But they are right, only time will tell. The first Earth-based object to visit the surface of Luton B is a vast tower of aluminum in the form of a lander, carrying with it a multitude of surface experiments, sensors, and even a compact rover for mobile exploration. While the surface probe begins its landing sequence, the Copernicus releases hundreds of tiny glimmering objects behind it. A 100-mile-long pearl necklace of communications, weather, mapping, and scanning satellites that will aid in both relaying new data while also discovering it themselves. The probe confirms a successful landing and goes dark after a few minutes, passing out of communication range until the new network of satellites can catch up. Unattended by human eyes, it has already begun an autonomous process of sample collection and surface photography. The images remind our colonist of Earth, or at least the more arid, lifeless parts, complete with a dull blue sky and visible water erosion. When the Copernicus completes another orbit, the lander has a veritable tsunami of data beamed up, complete with one particularly illuminating discovery. When a soil sample taken a few meters away from the landing crater is observed and exposed to a microbial fluorescent dye, the sample returns as negative. There does not appear to be life on land, at least with this one sample taken in one tiny spot on the world. But the landing site has been chosen in order to collect several differing types of materials, including one from a nearby inlet leading out into the vast oceans. The rover begins its trek, and after a day of moving slowly and carefully across the terrain, finally reaches a good spot to collect a fluid sample. All eyes in orbit are glued to a wide bank of screens showing all relevant data about the rover and its status, as the tiny fluid-filled tube is carefully inserted into a compartment underneath the rover. A few minutes pass until... negative. There doesn't appear to be anything living near the surface of the water world, where life was first predicted to have arisen on Earth billions of years ago. Several additional probes have splashed down in a wide swath of possible oceanic biomes, all returning the same. A few of these probes are even equipped with a few miles of cabling and deployable deepwater ROVs, which beam back fantastic videos of beautiful but still dead oceanscapes. Even in the depths, no life can be found. Luton B is truly barren. Which means that colonization can begin, but all who came in search of life now must look elsewhere. The next few months are a blur of activity. Space stations are mass-produced, surface infrastructure is landed, and the first team of humans step foot onto the arid world and plant a flag. Unfortunately, this does not include our colonists, as they have little by the way of electrical engineering awaiting them just yet. But they and all of the rest of the crew are just as proud. All that separates them from their destination is now just a few hundred miles compared to the 12 light years they started with, and soon many will join their footsteps to the initial landing parties. Now, while most of this video has been set up as a story to better understand what everyday conditions might be like for interstellar colonists, I'd like to break away from that structure for just a bit to talk about what kinds of projects or habitats would be expected of our newly arrived humans. The initial goal of the expedition is to simply touch down on the surface and create living and construction facilities facilities where they can be accessed and developed further. Terraformation is still on the drawing board, as they will need extensive knowledge of the surface, inner crust, and atmosphere of Luton B before they can make a plan for what needs to be changed to sustain life. Information not readily available to anyone looking down on the planet through a telescope. This is one of the main reasons why surface samples are so highly sought after in even modern space travel. While it is possible to discover atmospheric and surface makeup using spectral imaging, that only reveals the literal surface level info about a world. We will need to know what kinds of elements are present within the crust, from useful metals and gases to volatile or cavernous expanses of dangerous terrain. If the planet is to be terraformed, it may be wise to take a look at what will be uncovered during that process, as well as what we can use to accomplish this that is already present deep within the dirt. The full-scale habitats and surface infrastructure will come as soon as a viable and relatively stable area can be found, but in the meantime, the first large-scale task the crew will begin is the colonization of Luton B's orbit. The Copernicus is a nice ship, but no one will want to stay there any longer than is necessary, and the colonists not specialized in all that is required for the initial setup will need somewhere to live in the meantime. I've already mentioned that the crew had begun the construction of space station cores while en route, and now is the time for their deployment. Each of these gigantic cylindrical hubs will be the center of truly massive stations that will service human crews on their long stays in orbit, either awaiting terraformation or simply until the surface habs will have been constructed. Of course, there are many who will stay behind on these stations in order to complete further expansions and resupply drops, but many are ready to set foot on the world they have spent almost a lifetime trying to reach. The third object to land on Luton B carries no crew, but does contain precious cargo in the form of refineries, printers, and drilling platforms that will be the first of many to begin building what we need to live on the surface. While it may be easier to build large and massive infrastructure parts in the weightlessness of orbit, these parts will need to survive re-entry to be used on the ground, a costly and stressful procedure. Therefore, most of what we will build on the surface will be produced there. Building the orbital habitats will be relatively easy, but the ship will eventually run out of the pre-refined materials it took from Earth without finding new sources around the planet. Luckily, the Luton system contains a vast asteroid belt in a relatively close-by orbit around the star, and a fleet of small asteroid harvesters is ordered from the interior manufacturing bays. Soon the ship will have an unlimited supply of nearly every element in the universe, all without draining their target planet. The surface will develop gradually as more people are needed to complete things like habitats, greenhouses, launch pads, communications arrays, and surface travel infrastructure like roads or tracks that can carry freshly printed resources and the crew to all manner of locations. Power generation will be handled by one last piece of orbital construction in the form of a dropped nuclear reactor, whereas all future power needs may be met by simply mining and refining additional radioactive elements. Much to our colonists' excitement, this initial surface presence will require their services in order to wire up and test the electrical systems, and they, along with a few dozen others, are finally brought down to the surface. The lander touches down with a jolt, and the higher gravity is already a struggle to deal with, but as they spend more time on the planet, their extensive surgical alterations will strengthen to the point where the condition seems homelike. The door of the lander opens and reveals a rocky brown landscape with scattered crusts of a thin white crystalline stone, later revealed to be salt when a sample was taken. Most of the planet is underwater, with vast oceans far larger and deeper than Earth's, but a particularly large and resource-rich microcontinent has been selected for the initial base, no bigger in its surface area than New Zealand, yet representing one of the largest available areas for solid ground habitation. A few hundred meters away from the lander sits a large cylindrical habitat and several large containers of prefabricated machinery draped in parachute silk from their re-entry. His job is now to help unpack and install the equipment within the habitat and get it ready for the crew to use in studying the new world. The habitat was constructed and landed without the fragile systems it needs to operate, dropped separately to minimize unforeseen damages. In order for surface colonization, our traveler will need to bring online a few systems, primarily life support. Oxygen will be generated using an ablative method that will separate the oxygen from the surrounding silicate rock. One of the methods humanity has already implemented on Mars as of today, though it was done on the Perseverance rover as more of an experiment to see if such methods were feasible to supply large crews in the future, and use the atmospheric CO2 to accomplish this. The experiment has so far been a success, generating a whopping 10 grams of oxygen per hour, or about 20 minutes of breathable air per hour. A surprising amount considering it was a tiny module on the vehicle-sized rover and only meant to be a test of the system. The ablative chamber is wired up and connected first to a nuclear reactor. Our colonists 300 years in the future will have access to far smaller and vastly more efficient modules designed to withstand the harsh conditions on Luton B. The reactor in question is no bigger than a refrigerator, and is installed within a wall panel in the main habitat. No amount of radiation escapes containment, and the reactor is so small that a runaway thermal event is impossible due to its surface area. Once the machinery has been tested, the colonist activates the oxygen extractor, and a steady hiss of activity begins slowly filling the attached tanks, awaiting release for use in the finished habitat. The next necessity to be installed are the communications antennae, water purifiers, CO2 scrubbers, lighting, and onboard computers. This process takes several days of testing, connecting, and replacing damaged parts while the crew lives out of the lander. Eventually, the checklist is completed, and for the first time since they were last put into a coma, they have nothing left to accomplish. So they make a request to do what everyone else on the Copernicus has come here to do: explore. While the first base has been set up on land under a semi-thick atmosphere, the basin of an ancient and weathered crater had proved ideal for protecting against any asteroid impacts that would survive entry. The view is breathtaking, with iron oxide sands stretching out forever in wavy patterns shot through with large pocketed boulders. While the view reminds them of Mars, the terrain is significantly more eroded, due to the heavy atmosphere allowing for greater wind erosion as well as frequent rainstorms gathered from the vast humid oceans that surround their island. Looking out onto the sands, they see a familiar and symbolic sight, one that will doubtless be captured in future museums set up hundreds of years down the line. A single flag planted firmly in the rocks, waving gently in the breeze, the first action of human colonization. For our colonists, their life will be one of stresses and backbreaking work. Every ounce of infrastructure needs to be built by human hands. If something heavy needs to be moved, they will first need to build a machine to do it. If a road needs to be established, human hands will need to lay it. But this matters little to them. They and the rest of their crewmates have dedicated the rest of their lives to one of the most noble causes they can imagine: the continued prosperity of all future humankind. This is just one perspective of the hundreds of billions humanity has, and a small look into their lives, but many more will live vastly differing ones spread all throughout our domains. Some will be remembered, most will not. But our colonist thinks little of this. They are happy right where they are, standing on the bones of what will soon become another beautiful world in the empire of humanity. Our colonist's story is far from over, but has hopefully illustrated that while the future may appear glimmering, human hands will need to toil to make it a reality. And while the road to it may be difficult, to our colonists, there is nothing else like it. I hope you all enjoyed, and thank you so much for watching.